This is Shiting welcoming you to Backstage, the life behind the music. This is an online series of conversations with pianists, an exploration of their remarkable artistic lives as performers, teachers, and advocates for music. Through talking, I hope to shed some light on their process, to get a glimpse into some of their music making, the real work that takes place before they or their students step out onto the stage. Thank you so much for coming onto this show and to talk with me, Dr. Roux. I'm so excited to see you again. And I think I would like to start by asking you one of the questions I've always wanted to ask you is, can you talk a bit about your interest in old recordings? I remember you showing me recordings by Horowitz and even conductor Clavier. What qualities do these old pianist musicians have in their approach that you would think that young pianists should be aware of?
Well, it's interesting, you mentioned Kleiber, Horowitz. Actually, they're pianists we can listen to that are much older even than that. People like Friedman,
Yeah.
Cortot, Schnabel. I think, first of all, my interest is not just in old recordings. My interest is pretty much in all recordings. And we have a wide spectrum of recordings we can hear nowadays, beginning as far back as 1915, 1920. And there are some that are still older, of course. But, it's a miracle of modern technology that we can do this. Like we get a pretty good idea of how Rachmaninoff played, for example, in a way that we could never reconstruct from just reading everything that's written about the composer's playing. I think about back to my youth, like I grew up in the 1950s. If we had such a setup as we had today, I could have been listening to Liszt or Chopin playing. And, wouldn't that be a trip? We know Brahms made a recording in the late 1880s for Thomas Edison, and he announces he tells the world who he is, and you have a feeling in this that he sensed the importance of this new invention. It's almost like he's reaching out to posterity and to humanity. But the thing that I have learned from listening to recordings, ancient recordings of my youth, more modern performances, first of all, any age is going to have a wide variety of performance. If you talk about the kind of playing you would have had around 1900, 1920, 1930, the conventional wisdom is that it will be very indulgent, very free, very 19th century-ish. But then you'll find you listen to Emil von Sauer playing the Liszt Piano Concerti, and it turns out being very, very strict and straightforward rhythmically. Now, he was quite old at that time. Perhaps that didn't represent the way he was taught by Liszt or the way he was younger. But it is interesting to hear the continuity of performance styles. It's almost like dress fashions or something. Mid-century, you have musicians that were a little more faithful to the score, little conductors like Toscanini, Cassel, pianists like Rubinstein, Gilels, Richter. And yet they were trained by the older, more 19th century-ish musicians, but they sort of cleaned it up a little bit. Nowadays we're very, shall we say, urtexty, which is both good and bad in certain senses. But I think in listening to these recordings of any age, it's important to listen actively and to, the way the things you can get from a recording depend a little bit on where you are as a musician and the depth of your own understanding at the time you're listening. Uh, Let me give you an example. Like the first recording I ever had my parents buy when I was 7 years old was Serkin, Rudolf Serkin playing the Brahms Second Concerto with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Okay. And, you know, I followed up by many of Serkin's recordings when I was very young and listened to them and studied them, was heavily influenced by them. And then I went through a period where I was less interested in Serkin and more interested in other pianists. I came back to those old Serkin recordings I grew up with 30 years later, and they were completely different than what I had remembered. And of course, it wasn't Serkin that had changed or the performance. It was me that had changed. So, you know, this is the thing. If you're listening to recordings, you have to be careful you don't focus on surface qualities and miss sometimes the underlying qualities that really make the playing great. Like with Horowitz, a lot of young people will listen to that and they'll think, oh, it's loud and fast. Actually, a lot of it's not as fast as you think it is, but it's extremely clear. It has terrific underlying rhythm and pulse and clarity of articulation. These are the things that really make performance riveting and exciting. So the other thing is I find young people these days probably don't listen to enough music, you know, especially music of other mediums besides their instrument. And it's understandable because young people these days have many distractions. They have the computer, they have social media, they have to learn all kinds of things that we didn't have to learn when I was young. And you know, there are only 24 hours in a day, but you know, part of my advice to young people is don't let all that stuff take over your life too much. Right?
Yeah, yeah. What are your views on piano pedagogy and how has it evolved from the early days to the present of the piano pedagogy scene?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Shiting. I would say early in my career, we're talking about 1974 when I got my first teaching position in Kansas at Wichita State University. I was very influenced by the way my own teachers taught me. And, you know, I tended to parrot back the maxims and of my teachers. But more and more, as I got older, I just found I had to find my own way. And the results were much better once I just became more fully myself in teaching. You know, I think a teacher has to, in addition to being a good musician and a good pianist, and I think that you have to have an intense interest in other people, and you have to love the people that you're working with, I think. And you have to take genuine joy and delight in their successes, and you have to have genuine compassion in their lack of success at times. And I think it's important for a teacher to be flexible. You know, I find from student to student, I'll often be saying opposite things. And those opposite things are important because different people need to hear different things. You know, Walter Gieseking once said about teaching, you need to know not only what to say, but how much to say, when to say it, and to whom you can say such things. So I'm not much of a believer in methodology. I think it's dangerous if you listen to a class of students, if all the students sound the same, or if all the students play with the same general sound, phrasing, style. Now, admittedly, one can achieve a high level like that, but I don't think one can achieve the best level for each individual student that way.
I remember that when you demonstrating lessons, you always play with such economy of motion and you produce such a beautiful tone, beautiful sound. How did you learn that? Is it just natural, or did you specifically try to develop an efficient technique in your own practice? How important is it in your teaching?
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because most of my early training was actually high fingered. It was the old Russian type approach. And I don't remember developing a particularly beautiful sound when I was young. Later in my development, when I was in my early 20s, I came under the influence of John Perry, who was never my teacher, but became a good friend, and you know, I learned a lot from just speaking with him, watching him play, listening to his students. You know, the thing is, my hand tends to be a little bit like Perry's. It's rather thick, heavily muscled, and I'm the only person I know that can't touch my thumb and my fifth finger together unless I force it with another hand. I remember when I was a young child, the first piano lesson I got where the subject was crossing the thumb under. I was so frustrated, I almost gave up the piano. but anyway, this type of hand really prefers a rather close to the keys. This is a very strong, very solid hand, which naturally gets a rather thick, rich, non-percussive kind of sound. But this is not a very flexible hand. So there's not a lot of webbing between the fingers. So, you know, such a hand is not all that comfortable with high fingers. Even though I will say the high finger training did benefit me in many ways. But I think any discussion like this of economy of movement, minimum movement, it has to be nuanced because really the subject of piano playing from a standpoint of motion is a very, very complex subject. Like, let me just give you one example. Let's take jumps. Like, say the jumps in La Campanella. See, an economy of movement would prompt you to say, well, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, correct? But if you play those jumps, making a straight line movement, you're going to find it's very uncomfortable. And the reason it's very uncomfortable is the body does not like straight line movements. It perceives them to be abrupt. The body likes gradual movement, right? Which means not straight lines, but circles or ellipses, perhaps. So, you know, any discussion like this is not so simple. I mean, in general, I play close to the keys. I don't require all of my students do. I realize they're different kinds of hands. Like one of my colleagues when I was a student, Santiago Rodriguez, he had a very flexible hand with terrific webbing between the fingers, and he had a high fingered approach that for him was perfect. You know, he developed an amazing technique with that approach. But the main thing is that technique serves music. Music doesn't serve technique, right? So, and you know, if you watch great pianists play, you can see a wide variety of technical approaches, many of which achieve great artistic results. And in recent years, I'm a little bit more influenced by a kind of rotational aspect of technique. And again, that doesn't rule out high fingers or close to the keys, but it's sort of an added dimension.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm rather open-minded in these matters. But maybe not so open-minded that my brains fall out.
I have to say that I was trained with playing with high fingers back in China, and I found it very difficult to break that habit to play close to the key, to use rotation. But I definitely benefited a lot from it. Have you encountered students that experience the same thing as me? They have trouble breaking the bad habits, and how do you go about that?
Of course, and I mean the students that are very strongly formed in technique when they come to you, those will be the hardest ones in some ways to give up things that are not quite working for them. And the students that are relatively unformed in technique are probably the easiest to train in that sense, I think. But your hand is quite different than my hand, right? So a little bit of high fingers probably won't hurt you, right? Yeah.
How do you use when you hear auditions, when you meet new students? How do you spot talents? How do you define it, and how does it relate to a student's work habits?
Well, I'm not always accurate in my assessments on a 15-minute audition. Let me say that at the start. Generally, I would evaluate a young musician or young pianist in four dimensions. Number one, how good a pianist they are. In other words, how good physically they are, how good technically they are. Now, when I say technique, I mean more than just mechanics. I also mean the ability to get different sounds, different voicings. And in other words, the sum total of everything it takes physically to get an artistic result. So it's technique in a more encompassing sense. How good a pianist, number one. Number two, how good a musician. Do they follow basic principles of good musicianship? We're talking about strong beats, weak beats, phrasing toward dissonances or phrasing toward strong notes, etc. The third dimension is how good an artist they are. See, in my opinion, you can be a good musician but not be a good artist. The artist involves more imagination, creativity, individuality, that sort of thing. And finally, the fourth dimension is how good a performer you are. In other words, how do you look visually when you play, how you can sell a piece to an audience, how your personality projects. And it's sort of a mixture of those four things. I think, when you have a Richter or a Rubinstein that are off the scale strong in every respect, then you have a world-class artist. But most people are a little bit unequally strong in all four areas. So that's the way I look at it. And what we call a musical talent is actually a conglomeration of many talents. When you sense of rhythm, right? Ear, memory, phrasing, and even qualities of personality like confidence, belief in yourself. All these are important things. If you go on to a career, people skills are important.
I'm thinking of lessons with you from, I think it's 3 years now back. We worked on a lot of classical music, Beethoven, Mozart, and I worked a lot on Brahms and Schumann, like Romantic period, you seem to have a very unique conception of the music of Romantic era and Classical era. Can you talk about what is required of pianists in playing the music of these two periods?
Well, I think any great music is some kind of mixture of classicism and romanticism, right? I mean, certainly Mozart would be a epigon of the classical style, but yet if you listen to the second movement of his K488 A major concerto, it's a little on the romantic side, right?
Yeah.
But not aesthetically, of course. But it's interesting. Beethoven always came very easily to me. I think I played good Beethoven even as early as childhood. And maybe there was something in Beethoven's personality that sort of clicked with me. We know, for example, Beethoven was rather perfectionist, right? In other words, he'd write a few notes, then erase, right? Also, never satisfied with anything. Every new piece he would start would be a law unto itself and written under completely different premises. And see, Mozart was not like that. Mozart tended to, in his sonatas and concertos, he hit on a winning formula and pretty much stuck with it. But anyway, Beethoven, there's a certain volatility in Beethoven. I would also say his music is rather spiritual. It hits on eternal essences. If you listen to, say, the slow movement, Largo e Mesto of the Opus 10 number 3 sonata, such profound tragedy. It's almost like the eternal essence of tragedy. But I don't think Beethoven's music is sensual in any sense, that the way, say, some Tchaikovsky can be. So sensuality is not part of his expressive palette, and because sensuality is more of the body, right? Spirituality is more of the spirit and more elevated and in a way. The other thing about Beethoven is he's an emotional musician, highly emotional, maybe the most emotional ever. But he's not a sentimental musician. So, he expresses profound sadness at times, but does not cry. So I think it's important to know that about Beethoven. Mozart obviously requires a little bit lighter approach, leaner in sound. The difficulty with Mozart is that there's a certain simplicity there that's kind of a simplicity we don't understand well in modern times. We confuse simplicity with being simplistic, because the kind of simplicity Mozart has includes everything, includes every aspect of the human experience, in my opinion. Actually, when I was young, I played Mozart well from a note standpoint and musicality standpoint, but I really didn't come to a great understanding of Mozart in any kind of depth until I was in my late 20s. And then there was something just clicked, and I began to love the music more. I think there's some truth to the saying with Mozart that he's too easy for children and too hard for adults. Schumann, of course, the most romantic of all the major composers. Brahms, highly romantic in expression, and yet rather severe, and especially as you get into late Brahms, there's more pessimism. You see works like the last Rhapsody from Opus 119, begins in a major key, ends in a minor key. the Fourth Symphony of Brahms ends on a rather bitter note, right? We start the symphony in E minor. We're expecting to end triumphantly in E major, but we don't. So, you just try to get under the skin of the composer and see what lies under the surface. I listened to a tremendous amount of music when I was young. Like, but by the time I was 11, 12 years old, I knew all the Beethoven symphonies. I knew all the Brahms symphonies, and actually could make transcriptions of them at the piano. So, I didn't know them maybe in the academic sense, but but uh, but I knew them. Nevertheless, and the thing about music is it's a language, and just like spoken languages, it's most easily mastered at a young age, I think.
Yes. You
You
must
know,
have, you must have very good years to be able to do that at a very young age.
yeah, I always did have a good ear, and I always had a good ear retention. When I was maybe 10 years old, I could listen to a piece like, say, the Beethoven Sixth Symphony, hear it about 7 or 8 times, and know it from memory. Now, as I got older, that that sort of disappeared. Like something like that now, at my age, at 71 years old, I'd probably have to listen to it 100 times or 150 times. So it's much like language in that sense too. As you get older, that form of memory, it becomes weaker.
Mhm. I think I would like to wrap up today's interview by asking what advice do you have for the young generation of pianists who are entering the profession right now?
I would say this: listen to the best music making you can find, and listen to a lot of it. Set your standards high. I've had some students that they'll take the best student in my class, or say the best student at Rice University, and they'll say, "Oh, my goal is to get better than that person." And I always tell them, why isn't your goal to get better than Rubinstein or Ashkenazi, or they'll be entering a competition and they'll say, "Oh, I'm out to get this person," and I'll say, that person you're thinking about may be the least of your problems. So that my advice is listen a lot. Don't get distracted by too much by social media, and guard your time. I would say this: practice routinely, practice steadily. 4 or 5 hours a day should be enough. The only exception to that is if you're getting ready for the Clyburn or something, then you need 8 or 10 hours a day. But 4 to 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, that's enough. And don't practice yourself into a stupor, right?
Mhm.
And stay centered also. Like if you win a competition or you have a success, don't let it go to your head too much. Or if you have a disappointment, don't let it stop you. Winston Churchill once said that success consisted of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And I think as a final thing, I would say try to develop a joyous relationship to your art and to your musical studies. You're a musician first and a pianist second. You're an artist first and a musician second. And you're a human being first before any of those other three things.
Mhm. Yes. Thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful, and inspiring talk. This reminds me so much of lessons with you, and they were so inspiring, and I still remember it very well to this day. And I hope you take care, and I hope to visit you soon when this all ends. And then I hope you stay healthy and you stay well.
Me too, Shiting, and I have enjoyed all of your development and success and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.